Hello there, my sleep fellows. Tonight, let me guide you through a tender love story where hearts remember, time softens, and dreams unfold gently beneath the stars. Lay your worries down, close your eyes, and drift with me into a world where love whispers quietly and everything moves at the rhythm of your breath. Welcome to Romantic Sleepy Story, where timeless love tales are told under the lull of night. If these soothing journeys bring you peace, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, so we can share more moments together, night after night. It began with the wind. Long before the story was ever written, before Catherine spoke her name aloud to the sky, before Heathclif had found words for all the longing he never understood, there was only the wind on the moors, a lonely song that danced between heather and stone, echoing a secret that only the hills could keep. The Yorkshire moors were not gentle lands. They were raw and eternal, wild with thorn and mist, a place where even the trees leaned from the wind in permanent surrender. But in this untamed wilderness there was beauty, the kind that found its way into your chest and held your heart without ever asking. And it was here, beneath low clouds and soft rain, that two souls were drawn toward each other like dusk and twilight. Catherine Earnshaw was a girl carved by the wind itself, quick-tempered, curious, and never truly still. The daughter of Wuthering Heights, she ran barefoot through the bramble, climbed trees in her Sunday dress, and laughed like no one had ever told her what sadness was. Her eyes held the storm of the skies above, bright and wild and full of things no one else could name. And then there was Heathclif. No one knew quite where he came from, only that Mr. Earnshaw brought him home one rainy evening, a boy of few words and fewer belongings. He stood in the shadowed doorway of Wuthering Heights, soaked through and silent, his dark eyes carrying centuries of silence. Some called him strange, others worse. But Catherine had only looked once, and something in her stilled. They were children, but not like other children. While others played games in sunlit gardens, Catherine and Heathclif ran across the moors like foxes, losing their way on purpose, letting the wind name them again and again. They chased clouds, whispered secrets into the grass, and sat beside old stones, dreaming of places the world had never heard of. Even then, something gentle stirred between them. Not love, as the world defines it, but something older, quieter, and infinitely more permanent. "Do you ever think the wind is calling?" Catherine asked one evening, her hair tangled with thistle, her eyes locked on the horizon. Heathclif didn't answer at first. He just turned toward the soundless moors, letting the breeze press against his cheek like a memory. Then he said softly, "Yes, but it only speaks when you're with me." They didn't know what that meant, not really. But it didn't matter. In a world that often misunderstood them, they had made a universe of their own, built from laughter, shared silence, and the unspoken promise that they would never be truly apart. At night, when the rest of Wuthering Heights slept beneath the creaking rafters and groaning winds, Catherine would sneak out to the edge of the hill just beyond the house. Heathclif would already be there, waiting in the dark, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his boots muddied from the day's wandering. They didn't speak much then, they just sat together. And in that quiet, something sacred took root. No vows, no kisses, no poetry, just the steady beat of two hearts that had never asked permission to fall into the same rhythm. It was not a fairy tale, it was something harder, stranger, something carved from the land and wind and time itself. And yet, to them, it was everything. The moors were not empty anymore. They held their stories like soft footprints fading into moss, like laughter still echoing in the heather. Years passed slowly, as they often do in forgotten places. Catherine became lovelier, though not in a way that pleased society. She was wild still, untamable. And Heathclif grew into something darker, deeper, still silent, still strange, but with a gaze that could quiet even the sharpest voices. Their bond remained, though the world tried to pry them apart. "You and I," Catherine whispered once, lying on her back in the tall grass. "We're made of the same thing, Heathclif. Whatever the moors are, whatever the wind carries, that's us. Don't you feel it?" Heathclif turned toward her slowly, his voice low and hoarse. "I do, and I always have. But time is a thing no heart can outrun. And though their love was fierce and rooted in something wordless, the world beyond Wuthering Heights waited, with its expectations, its rules, and its unrelenting need for order." On a grey morning, the first letter arrived. It was from Thrushcross Grange, the neighbouring estate. An invitation, polite, noble, and entirely unwelcome. Catherine held the paper in her hands like it burned her fingers. "They want me to visit. Father says it's
time I learned to be a proper lady." Heathclif didn't say anything.
His silence wrapped around him like fog, and for the first time Catherine couldn't read his face. "I don't belong there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I belong here, with you." Still Heathclif remained silent. The wind pressed against the window, restless, uncertain. Later that night she left for the Grange, and the moors fell quiet. The heather no longer laughed beneath their footsteps. The wind no longer carried whispered names. And in the silence, something sacred began to ache. But what would happen when morning came, and feelings could no longer
hide? The carriage wheels creaked along the muddy path as it departed Wuthering Heights, leaving behind nothing but a faint trail of flattened grass and unsettled mist. Catherine sat stiffly, her back straightened by the corset she'd been reluctantly
helped into that morning, her eyes locked on the distant hills she knew by heart. The moors faded slowly from view, swallowed by trees and hedges too neatly trimmed, too carefully placed. And as the wind failed to follow her, she realized with a soft ache that it had never belonged to her alone. It had always been shared. Thrushcross Grange was beautiful in the way paintings are beautiful, polished, symmetrical, and perfectly still. The lawns were trimmed to perfection, the gardens bloomed in carefully ordered colours, and the windows gleamed with the kind of clarity that left no room for dust or dreams. It was, in every way, the opposite of Wuthering Heights, and it made Catherine feel like she had stepped into a story that didn't want her in it. The Lintons were kind. Edgar, with his pale, soft features and formal smile, and Isabella with her light laughter that never quite reached her eyes. Their world was filled with porcelain and pleasantries, of tea at the correct hour, and walks no longer than 30 minutes, and books that were always returned in pristine condition. It was a world where emotion was trimmed as neatly as the hedges where wildness was something to be tamed, not treasured. Catherine tried. She sat properly at dinner, nodded politely during conversation, and let her hair be arranged into curls that refused to hold. But her mind wandered. It drifted to the high cliffs and whistling winds, to a boy who rarely spoke, but always understood, to the way the moors had once felt alive under her feet. And she wondered, did Heathclif still go out at night to sit beneath their hill? Did he still listen for the wind and hope, perhaps to hear her voice carried within it? She missed him more than she dared admit. Meanwhile, back at Wuthering Heights, the absence of Catherine was not a quiet thing. It was a wound, one that lingered, raw and pulsing, in the hollow spaces where her laughter used to echo. Heathclif wandered the moors alone now, his feet retracing the same paths they once shared, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as though holding on to some last piece of
warmth. He never said her name aloud.
But in the stillness of the kitchen, in the cold of the stables, in the shadowed corners of the house, it was as if her presence still stirred the air. Nellie, the housekeeper, watched him with quiet worry. You could write to her, she offered one evening as he sat by the hearth, unmoving. Heathcliff stared into the flames. She's where she belongs now, he said, though the words tasted bitter. You don't believe that, Nellie replied gently. He didn't answer, but late that night, long after even the fire had fallen asleep into embers, Heathcliff sat at the small wooden desk upstairs. He dipped the quill in ink with shaking fingers and began to write. Not poetry, not grand declarations, just thoughts, memories, a piece of the wind trapped on the page. Catherine, do you remember the heather by the East Hill? It bloomed early. This year, I thought you might have laughed to see it beat the calendar. The moors miss you, or maybe it's just me pretending they do. I listened for your voice in the wind today. It was quiet. Yours, H. He never sent it. Instead, he folded it neatly and placed it in a wooden box beside his bed, where it joined another and another, a silent collection of unsent feelings and untold truths. Catherine, too, felt the tug of unwritten words. Every evening at Thrushcross Grange, as the light grew soft and golden, she would sit by the window with a letter half started. Her pen hovered over the paper as if her heart had something to say, but was too afraid to say it. What would she write? That she felt caged, even among beauty? That Edgar was kind, but not warm? That the laughter here was thinner, and the wind carried no names? She didn't know how to begin. Instead, she wandered the manicured gardens, trailing her fingers along the hedges, wishing they were wild, wishing for the rough stone walls of Wuthering Heights, for the smell of the firewood, for the sound of boots thudding across old floorboards, and more than anything, she wished for the silence they used to share, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. One afternoon, Edgar joined her by the garden arch. You seem far away these days, Catherine, he said, offering her a gentle smile. She returned it, polite but hollow. I'm just thinking, that's all. Of home? He asked. She nodded, but her heart whispered a different answer. Later, that night, as a soft rain fell and thunder rolled far in the distance, Catherine lay in her room, wide-eyed beneath the embroidered quilt. The Grange was warm, but she felt cold. She remembered the night air of Wuthering Heights, sharp and free. She remembered the way Heathcliff's shoulder would brush hers as they sat under the stars, the way he never asked anything of her, except to stay. And she began to cry. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears, like raindrops slipping from a branch, like a heart unravelling thread by thread. Far away, Heathcliff sat on the hill alone, his collar turned up against the wind. He stared at the house that no longer held her, and wondered if she had already forgotten the sound of their shared silence. He took out another piece of paper. Catherine, do you feel it too? The stillness that's not peace, the distance between heartbeats?
I don't belong anywhere but beside you. I don't know how to say it without scaring it away. Yours still, H. He folded it, boxed it, and closed his eyes. And so the days passed, with unspoken words piling like snow between them. They lived in
different worlds now, one behind carved banisters and chandeliers, the other beneath smoke-stained beams and candle shadows. But the wind still blew across the moors. It whispered their names when no one was listening. It rustled the grass where their feet had once danced. And when it rained, it carried the scent of memory, of days when silence was comfort and love was not a thing you had to explain. The letters remained unread. The hearts remained full, and somewhere in that space between longing and fear, between two souls who had never needed words, a question remained. Would love survive the silence, or vanish with the next breath of wind? It was a morning wrapped in silver mist, the kind that hung low across the moors like a curtain not yet drawn. Catherine sat quietly in the carriage, her gloved fingers resting against the pane of rain-speckled glass. Drops slid down in slow, meandering trails, mimicking the thoughts that had refused to settle inside her chest for days. She hadn't planned to return to Wuthering Heights, not so soon. The invitation had come from her brother Hindley, half-hearted and burdened with formality, but it was enough to stir something in her, something that had never truly been still. The roads felt longer this time, or perhaps it was her heart, reluctant and uncertain, knowing that each turn of the wheel brought her closer to a place that no longer fit her shape, but still held her soul. As the carriage crested the final hill, the old silhouette of Wuthering Heights came into view, rough, defiant, and unmoved by time. The chimneys still leaned stubbornly into the sky, the stone walls stood damp and strong against the wind, and from this distance it looked exactly as she had left it. Yet nothing felt the same. Her heart thudded softly, not loudly enough to be noticed, but just enough to be known. Inside the house, Heathcliff stood by the hearth, unmoving. He had known she would come. The moment the rain had begun to fall, a knowing had stirred in his chest like an echo returning home. He didn't ask why or how. Some truths live in the marrow and don't require reason. The front door creaked open. A familiar sound. A familiar presence. Catherine stepped inside. The warmth of the fire barely reached her. The scent of smoke and old stone filled her lungs, like memory. She took a step forward, her boots faintly echoing on the worn wooden floor, and looked around as if seeing her childhood in ghost form. And then, from the dim corner of the room, Heathcliff emerged. Neither of them spoke. He looked
older somehow?
Not in years, but in weight, as if silence itself had grown heavy on his shoulders. His hair was darker, his eyes deeper, and though he stood still, he seemed carved by storm and solitude. Catherine's breath caught, not audibly, but enough, for her eyes to soften. "Heathcliff," she said, barely above a whisper. He gave a small nod, nothing more. The space between them was filled with unsaid things. It stretched long and uncertain like a tightrope between two cliffs. "I didn't
think I'd miss the creak of that door," she murmured, forcing a small smile.
"But I did." Still he said nothing. He only stepped aside so she could sit, should she wish. She did. They sat together, not beside one another, but across the hearth, the firelight flickering between them like a barrier too fragile to break. Time passed. The clock ticked in the corner. Rain dripped from the eaves outside, steady and slow. Catherine looked into the flames. I thought about writing. I know, Heathcliff replied quietly. His voice was deeper now, worn smooth, like stone in the river. She glanced at him, surprised by his certainty. How? He hesitated, then simply said, because I wrote, almost every night. Something trembled in her chest. Did you send them? No. He looked at her then, fully, and in that gaze was the sound of unsent letters, the ache of waiting, the shadow of every quiet evening alone. I couldn't find the right words, she admitted, not the ones that wouldn't hurt. They all hurt, he said. That's how you know they were real. For a moment, neither moved. The storm outside grew louder, tapping against the windows like fingers seeking entry. But inside, a strange warmth grew, not from the fire, but from memory. Do you remember the East Hill? Catherine asked softly. The heather's probably all crushed by now. Heathcliff nodded. I still go there. The heather still grows. A silence followed, and then, gently, she asked, Did you ever wait for me there? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he rose, left the room briefly, and returned with a small wooden box. He placed it before her and stepped back. Catherine opened the lid slowly. Inside, bundled neatly and tied with soft string, were dozens of letters, folded, untouched, but not unread, not by the soul that had poured itself into each one. Her eyes welled, though no tears fell. She traced her fingers over the papers, then looked up at him. You never stopped, she said, voice unsteady. No, he answered, simple and bare. She closed the box with care, as if holding something sacred. I didn't mean to forget how much I loved the wind, she whispered. But everything at the Grange, it's like a lullaby you're not allowed to wake from. Heathcliff stepped closer now. Then why come back? Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a long moment she said nothing. And then, as if the storm itself breathed through her, she replied, because the silence there is empty. But here, it's full of everything we never said. The fire crackled between them, their eyes held 1,000 unfinished conversations, and for the first time in so long, the quiet didn't feel like distance.
It felt like home. I don't know how to belong in both places, she confessed. I wish I could. Heathcliff's voice was low. You were never meant to belong to anything but the moors. They're in you, and you're in me. She felt.
The words sink deep, threading through every part of her that had felt lost in lace and etiquette. Outside, the storm raged harder, but the room held steady. A small, unshakable space carved by memory, by love, and by the ache of time. Neither
stood.
Neither moved to close the gap between them, but something changed. The space between heartbeats grew smaller. The letters remained in her lap, proof that time could pass, but some things refused to fade. The room around them softened, the fire, dimming into a gentle glow, and the air felt warmer than it had all winter. Catherine leaned slightly forward. I'm afraid. Of what? He asked. That I'll leave again, she said, and forget how it felt to sit like this. Shook his head gently. You won't, because now you know where your silence lives. And in that quiet, as the rain whispered against the windows and the fire sighed low, they remembered who they were, not just to each other, but to the wind, the moors, and the forgotten spaces between spoken words. But what would happen when the world called her back? and she had to choose between where she was and where her heart had always stayed. The wind had quieted by morning. It no longer cried at the windows but hummed low across the moors, like a memory trying not to wake. Inside Wuthering Heights, the light slipped gently through the curtain edges, painting the wooden floor in soft patches of grey and gold. Catherine stood at the window, her fingers touching the cold pane, her breath barely rising as mist against the glass. She had not slept. Even after the fire had burned low and the house had fallen still, her heart remained restless, stretched between the warmth of a world that asked her to become someone else and the ache of another where she had never needed to pretend. Behind her, the silence of the house was familiar. Every board beneath, the rug, every creak of the stairs, every sigh of the old roof above, it all belonged to her in a way nothing at Thrushcross Grange ever had. Yet it was not possession she longed for. It was belonging. And that, she had discovered, was far rarer. Catherine turned away from the window, her eyes drifting over the room. A book left askew on the shelf. A shawl, once hers, still hanging, behind the door. A boot by the hearth that no longer fit her foot. Little remnants of a time too far gone to live in, but too close to forget. She wrapped her arms around herself and stepped into the corridor. Downstairs, Heathclif was already awake. He stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, his hands damp from the pump outside. He didn't look up as she entered, but she felt his awareness of her, like a pull in the air that needed no name. "I thought you'd gone," he said simply. "I thought about it," she replied, but the storm hadn't finished speaking. He gave a small nod and returned to slicing bread with a calmness that felt almost forced. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was filled with something new. Not just absence, but hesitation, the kind of pause that comes when hearts remember what it costs to feel. "Do you ever wish we'd been different?" Catherine asked quietly, watching the knife move rhythmically through the loaf. He stopped, blade midway, and set it down. "No," he said, turning toward her. "But I wish the world had been." Her breath caught in her throat, not from the words themselves, but from the weight behind them. She crossed the room slowly and sat at the edge of the table, her eyes fixed on the wood grain beneath her fingertips. "I used to think we were wild because no one tamed us," she whispered. "But maybe we were wild because it was the only way to survive in this place." Heathcliff sat down across from her, elbows on the table, fingers laced. "You were never meant to be tamed." "But I let them," she said. "I let them shape me, dress me, silence me." "You were never silent," he said, and for the first time in so long, a faint smile touched his lips. "You just spoke in ways no one else could hear." The words sat between them like a candle, not bright, but steady. Later that day, Catherine wandered the moors alone. The skies were clearing, but the ground remained damp, soft beneath her boots. She walked slowly, trailing her fingers along, the stone walls brushing the heather that had begun to bloom again. Every path she took was one they had once shared. Every bend, every rock, every hollow in the hill whispered stories only she and Heathclif could understand. She remembered the games they used to play, chasing shadows and pretending the clouds were ships, the hills were kingdoms, and the sky itself was theirs to claim. She paused at the edge of a cliff, the wind teasing at her hair. Below, the valley stretched wide and quiet, as if waiting. She sat on a flat stone and closed her eyes, letting the breeze move over her skin like a voice too old to name. Memories returned in fragments. Heathcliff's laugh when she dared him to leap across the stream, the smell of rain on his coat, the feel of his shoulder beside hers when they watched lightning roll across the hills, and one moment in particular. A night when neither of them had spoken. Yet she had fallen asleep with her head resting near his knee, the grass wet beneath them, and the stars flickering through the cloud breaks. It had been a moment too tender to touch, and now too far to hold. A small tear slipped from the corner of her eye, and she wiped it away before it could reach her cheek. By the time she returned to the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised. With soft blues and amber, she found Heathcliff in the study, staring into the fire. The wooden box of letters sat open beside him. He didn't look up as she entered, but his hand reached out and rested on the folded paper at the top of the pile. "Did you ever write one you wished you could have sent?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Only one." She stepped closer. "What did it say?" He looked up at her then, eyes shadowed but alive. "That even if you never returned, I'd still wait." Her heart shivered in her chest. She sank into the armchair opposite him, the silence again pressing soft between them. She reached out and picked up the letter on top. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. It was dated 2 winters ago. Short. Simple, Catherine. Even if the seasons forget your footsteps on the moors, I won't. Even if the wind stops calling, I will remember your voice. I don't need you to come back. I only need to know you once called this place home. Yours, H. She read it twice before placing it back in the box. Then she stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside his chair. She rested her hand lightly over his. "I never stopped calling this place home," she whispered, "even when I was trying to build another." He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers gently. They sat like that as the fire cracked softly, the shadows dancing along the walls. The moors stretched silent beyond the windows, but inside the room, the world felt full again, not whole, not healed, but full, and sometimes that was enough. As the night deepened and the house settled once more into stillness, Catherine leaned her head gently against his knee, just as she had once, years ago, and closed her eyes. He didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on her hair and let the silence hold them. But how long can hearts rest in borrowed time before life pulls them back apart? The morning light filtered softly through the fog, pale and unsure, as if it too questioned whether to rise. The hearth had long since cooled, but the scent of ash and faint lavender lingered in the room where Catherine still slept, her head gently tilted against the side of the armchair, knees curled slightly toward her chest, like a child returning to a place they'd once felt safe. Heathcliff hadn't moved. He had sat awake the entire night beside her, one hand still tangled loosely in the hem of her shawl, the other resting idly on his knee, fingers half-curled like they'd forgotten their purpose. His gaze had not left her, not out of obsession, but of reverence, as if looking too long might somehow erase her. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves into a soft rustle, carrying whispers down from the hills, sounds that would go unnoticed by any other soul but him. When Catherine's eyes opened, they were slow, dream-heavy. For a moment, she didn't quite know where she was, until she smelled the smoke, saw the old rug beneath her feet, and felt the quiet weight of his presence near. She stirred, stretching slightly. "I didn't mean to fall asleep," she said. her voice hoarse with sleep. "You never meant to stay," Heathcliff replied gently. Her eyes turned to him, searching his face, not for anger, but for the hurt that always lived behind his calm. "I didn't want to leave either," she whispered. The quiet between them deepened, thick as mist. In the kitchen, the kettle remained empty, untouched. No one had lit the fire, no breakfast prepared. And yet, nothing about the morning felt unfinished. It was as if the house itself had paused to allow this moment. "I have to return," Catherine said eventually. "They'll notice I'm gone too long." He nodded, unsurprised. "Thrushcross Grange doesn't wait." "But it doesn't hold me either," she added, her voice fraying like thread pulled too tight. She rose slowly, her legs reluctant, her heart unsure of its place. She smoothed the folds of her dress, her fingers trembling more than they ought to. And when she looked around the room, it felt like a painting she couldn't carry with her, only visit in memory. Heathcliff stood too, slower, heavier. "I could walk you to the edge of the moors," he offered. She hesitated. "And after that?" His eyes lowered slightly. "After that, I'll watch you leave again." It hurt more than she expected. They stepped out into the cold together. The air had changed, less stormy now, more still. The clouds thinned enough to let sunlight dapple the grass, but the light didn't warm. It only revealed the shapes of things better left in shadow. They didn't speak much as they walked. The moors greeted them like an old friend, distant, quiet, and unchanged. The ground was still damp, the heather brushed lightly at their sides, and above them the clouds shifted in slow, melancholy waves. When they reached the familiar slope where the paths split, one toward the Grange, the other back to the heights, Catherine stopped. Her eyes traced the hills, the house barely visible in the distance, and then turned to Heathcliff. "I don't know how to make this easier," she said. "You're not meant to," he replied. "Some things aren't supposed to be softened. I thought love was supposed to be soft." He paused, looking out toward the hills. "Not ours." She stepped closer, close enough that her breath reached his collar. "If you asked me to stay," he looked at her fully now, "I wouldn't. Because you'd always wonder if I loved you for who you were, or for who I wanted you to remain." The ache in her chest spread, slow and certain. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed. "You're both," he said. "And that's why it hurts." A single tear found its way to her cheek. She didn't wipe it, she let it fall. He reached forward and gently touched the side of her face, not possessively, but as if trying to memorize her shape. His fingers were rough, calloused by years of working soil and stone, but his touch was careful, like she might vanish beneath it. "You'll go," he said softly, "but the wind will carry your footsteps back to me." She leaned into the warmth of his palm, closing her eyes. "I'll write," she promised. "You won't," he said, without cruelty. "And that's all right." The wind picked up then, stirring her hair, wrapping around them like a thread too, fine to hold. And before it could tear, she stepped back. He didn't follow. She walked, slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the moor's soft belly. The path ahead, blurry with rising mist. And when she looked back, he was still there. Just a shadow among shadows, standing on the hill like a sentinel of memory. Heathcliff turned only when she disappeared over the ridge. Back at Wuthering Heights, he returned to the study, closed the box of letters and placed it back on the shelf. He sat by the window staring at the sky as clouds began to gather once more. He reached for a blank page. "Catherine, today you left without saying it. Goodbye." But I heard it anyway. In the way your boots hesitated on the gravel, in the way you didn't turn twice.
"I won't write again, but I'll wait. Yours still, H." He folded it carefully, and this one he burned. The flame curled its edges, lifted the ashes into the air, and let them scatter, like a memory too tender to keep, but too strong to forget. But
how long could love survive when the heart could neither stay nor truly leave? Thrushcross Grange welcomed her back with blooming flowers and carefully arranged smiles. The doorman bowed, Isabella chattered politely about an upcoming dinner, and Edgar greeted her with calm civility, as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't vanished into the rain and returned days later with silence in her eyes and moorland in her bones. Catherine smiled where expected, responded when prompted, and resumed her role in the tidy dream they all clung to. But inside she was quieter now, not in voice, but in presence. Her laughter came slower. Her gaze lingered on windows more often than mirrors. And every now and then, when no one was looking, she would press her palm against her chest, as if checking whether something had stayed behind or returned with her. She had carried Heathcliff back with her, not in body, not even in promise, but in shadow. His absence lived in the corners of her room, in the breeze that slipped through the curtains, in the way she no longer found joy in books or walks or light conversation. He was not here, but neither was she, not fully. And in that space between, a ghost began to form. Not the ghost of someone dead, but the ghost of someone divided. Days passed with ceremony, morning tea, embroidery, pleasant company. Edgar spoke often of quiet futures, of gardens she might help plan, of rooms she could decorate once they were married. His intentions were kind, and his affection sincere. But to Catherine, it felt like she was being gently wrapped in silk only, to be tucked away in a drawer. One afternoon, as rain tapped faintly at the windows, she sat before her mirror, staring not at her reflection, but through it. "I'm not unhappy," she said aloud, though no one was there to hear her. But the room didn't answer. The walls gave no comfort, because what she meant was, "I'm not myself." That evening, she wandered through the library and found herself drawn to an old drawer near the back of the desk. Hidden beneath paperweights and ribbon was a journal she hadn't touched in years. She opened it with hesitant fingers. Inside were pages filled with wild scrawl, poems and notes from younger days, some written in tandem with Heathcliff beneath, the trees, their ink, smeared from rain and laughter. She flipped to a blank page. "Wuthering Heights still lives inside me. I thought leaving would quiet it, but I only hear it louder now. It calls in the night, in my chest, in the wind. How can I be two things, and whole in neither?" She closed the journal quickly as though afraid the words might be overheard. Next morning, Edgar brought her a bouquet of white roses, arranged with care. Catherine thanked him, smiled gently, and placed them in a vase near the hearth. But later that day, when no one was watching, she added a single wild thistle from the garden, thorny and unbending, tucked among the softness. She didn't say why, she only knew it looked truer that way. Meanwhile, at Wuthering Heights, the house breathed more heavily without her. Nellie noticed it first. The way Heathcliff stayed longer by the windows, the way he lingered on the moors until dark, returning with boots caked in mud and eyes rimmed red, though he never cried. "He doesn't sleep," she whispered to Joseph. "Doesn't eat properly either." Joseph only muttered something about cursed hearts and godless love, but Nellie knew better. This wasn't madness or folly. This was love stripped raw by time. One night, Heathcliff stood beneath the old ash tree, hands in his coat pockets, staring up at the moonlight breaking through the fog. His thoughts were heavy, not with hope that had long since turned to ash, but with the weight of remembering. "She left again," he said softly, though no one stood near. The wind didn't answer, but it wrapped around his shoulders like a quiet truth. "I let her go." The stars blinked overhead. "I think," he added, almost choking on the words, "that she wanted me to." A week later, a letter arrived at the Grange. It was unsigned. No seal, no crest, just a folded sheet of paper with smudged ink. There are places that only exist for two souls. The rest of the world forgets them, but we remember. If ever you return, I'll be there. But if not, let the wind carry your name back to me. Catherine read it twice, then tucked it into the pages of her old journal, pressing it like a flower, too delicate to be touched. That night, she walked alone through the gardens, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and roses. The moon cast long shadows on the gravel path, and as she wandered beneath the arbour, her eyes turned toward the hills beyond the estate. Somewhere out there, past the hedges and fences, past society's grace and the shape she was meant to wear, was the boy who had once made her feel like lightning lived in her bones, and she wondered, could a heart truly belong to two worlds, or did loving one mean losing the other? When she returned inside, the fire had gone cold. She sat by the ashes anyway, wrapping her shawl around her and closing her eyes. And in the quiet, she let herself imagine it. Heathcliff, sitting just across the hearth, silent as ever. The wind,
outside still wild. The moors still vast. And between them, a ghost.
The version of herself she could never fully bring home again. But what happens when the heart becomes too tired to keep wandering, and the soul must choose where to rest? The fire had nearly died by the time Catherine stepped through the door. Dripping, wet, cheeks flushed from the wind, she stood at the threshold like a girl who had returned from a dream she could not escape. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, rainwater pooling at her feet, but she did not care. She had come not for comfort, but for truth. Heathcliff looked up slowly from the hearth. "I wasn't sure you would," he said, his voice low, unreadable. Catherine blinked away the rain from her lashes. "I wasn't sure I could." He rose, took a step forward, and for a long moment they simply stood there, the space between them filled not with distance, but with every word never said, every letter never sent. She took another step closer. The wood creaked beneath her, announcing her presence like a heartbeat. "I read them," she said softly. His brow furrowed. "The letters?" She nodded. "The ones you burned, the ones I wasn't meant to find. I found the ash, Heathcliff. I could still feel the shape of your words in the air." A silence fell then. Not heavy, not harsh, but fragile, like a candle flame in wind. He did not speak, and so she crossed the remaining distance and placed her hand lightly over his. "I came because I couldn't hear myself at the Grange anymore," she whispered. "But here, with you, even the rain
knows my name." He closed his eyes just once, as if bracing for the ache. "Catherine," he breathed. And it was not a greeting, not a plea. It was a vow, a tether. She had never heard her name spoken like that before. as if it were sacred.
as if it were a song written just for one stormy night. She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he let his arms circle her shoulders, unsure if it was forgiveness or farewell they shared. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the walls of Wuthering Heights, two hearts, long torn by silence, pulsed in the same rhythm once more. She did not ask to stay. He did not ask her to go. Instead, they sat together on the rug beside the dying fire. The storm still wept at the windows, but it no longer mattered. The storm had brought her here. The storm had named them both, and when the last embers finally gave way to ash, Catherine fell asleep with his hand in hers, steady, warm, and quiet. But what dreams will come when the heart still carries 1,000 unsaid goodbyes? The next morning dawned in silence, shrouded in a soft grey sky and a light breeze that barely stirred the ivy on Kensington's walls. The air smelled faintly of rain, though none had fallen, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting. Victoria stood on her balcony in a dove-coloured dress, her hands resting gently on the cool stone railing. A wren perched nearby, wings tucked, watching her like a silent companion. Today was different. She could feel it in her fingertips. Albert had returned. This knowledge had burned within her since yesterday, like an unlit candle flickering quietly in her chest. And yet nothing had been said, no mention of the letters, the petals, the silence they had shared. Maybe it wasn't time yet. Not for the first time, she wondered what love looked like before it had a name. Was it those glances, those half-written thoughts exchanged between people like folded pieces of paper in a classroom? Was it a slow understanding like moonlight slowly falling across the floor? There was a gentle knock on her door. Her lady-in-waiting entered, bowed, and said, "His Highness Prince Albert requests permission to walk with your Majesty in the rose garden, if it pleases you." Victoria nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. "Tell him I'll be right there." She took her time with the preparations. Not out of vanity, but to calm her breathing. She chose a soft scarf, the light blue one she'd worn on the first day they'd
Met. The gloves, too. Both were now done. She tucked her diary under her arm.
Not because she wanted to write, but because it gave her something to hold on to. Albert was already waiting under the rose trellis. At first, he stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind his back, his coat gently fluttering in the breeze. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, and in that moment something happened between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming, just the realization that two people had quietly built something while the world wasn't watching. "Good morning," he said, offering her his hand. She gently placed her hand in his. "That's it." They walked side by side along the winding path of the garden. The rose bushes had thinned out, their last blossoms clutching the last remnants of summer. Petals lay scattered on the gravel like memories. For a long time, neither of them said a word. But it wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was the most pleasant part of her day, walking with someone who wasn't afraid of silence. Finally, Albert stopped beside a marble bench between two tall hedges. He turned to her with the same thoughtful gaze, a gaze that never felt searching, but only seeing. "There's something I wanted to say," he began, then paused, as if the words had decided to stay just out of his reach. She waited and made
room for him. But he said nothing. Instead, he sat down slowly and looked up at the sky, his brow slightly furrowed, not in frustration, but in thought.
"Have you ever wanted to say something?" he murmured, but we're afraid it might not sound right if you said it out loud." Victoria's heart beat faster, but her voice remained calm. "Often," she said. "Too often, actually. That's why I write." He smiled weakly. "I started doing the same thing." A quiet silence spread between them, and then she sat down beside him, her skirts flowing gently around her, like mist on marble. "May I show you something?" she asked. He nodded. She opened her diary, not at the beginning, but in the middle, to one of the letters she had written and never sent. Not the first, not the last, but the one that carried her voice in its most exposed form. She didn't give it to him. She read aloud, "Your way, listening, walking, returning a lost glove, has changed the way I go through my day.
I search for meaning in silence, just like you. I was taught not to need anything, but you have reminded me that wanting is not a weakness. It's human." When she was finished, she carefully closed the diary and placed it on her lap. Albert said,
Nothing for a moment. Then he turned completely towards her, the expression in his eyes gentle and calm. "I didn't know whether to write back," he said. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid that putting it into words might break the spell." "It wouldn't," she said, almost whispering. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, cream-coloured, worn at the edges. Without a word, he handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a poem, this time not by Goethe, not by Shakespeare. It was his own. "I first saw you through falling leaves, not like a queen, but like a pause in time. You walked as if the earth were only whispering to you, and I listened, as if the world had stood still for a moment, so that I can hear your name in silence." Her hand trembled slightly as she folded it again. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, not with tears, but with certainty. "You almost spoke today," she said quietly. "I have that. You don't have to, not yet. But I want to." The wind stirred the garden again, and a rose petal rose from a nearby bush, danced among them, and then fell to the ground. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his. No explanation, not yet, but a promise, of words still forming, of love not yet spoken, but deeply and truly understood. So they sat there until the sky warmed with the colours of the approaching evening, and although no one said, "I love you," both knew it was near, and what would it sound like if the silence finally gave him a voice? The next morning it rained, gently and dreamily, more like a lullaby than a storm. The drops tapped softly against the Kensington windows, leaving lazy trails like ink on parchment. Inside the palace, everything moved a little slower. Footsteps were muffled on the carpets, voices in the corridors fell silent, as if the whole world had decided to whisper for a day. Victoria didn't mind the rain at all. It suited her mood. She stood at the high window of her music room, watching. The grey light spread across the garden. Her fingers rested on the back of a velvet armchair, her thoughts far from royal documents or obligations. They were with him, and with the moment they had almost shared. Yesterday had brought no explanation, no confessions, no comprehensive words. And yet something had happened between them that no letter could have captured. He had given her a poem. She had shown him a piece of her heart. And somehow in those unspoken lines a truth had taken root, deeper than any spoken vow could. She fell in love, not in the dramatic, wind-swept way she'd read about in novels. It was something slower, quieter, but no less real. It was a gentle unfolding, like a rose blooming with each delicate petal. She stepped back from the window and walked toward the piano. Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys. Then, almost mindlessly, she began to play a gentle, wistful melody she had composed years ago and forgotten. The notes flowed through the room like breath, and with each chord, her thoughts became more and more in tune with her heart. The door behind her squeaked open. She didn't turn around. Somehow she knew who it was. Albert's steps were cautious on the wood. When he reached the edge of the carpet, he stopped. "I didn't mean to interrupt you," he said quietly. "You didn't," she replied, still playing. "I was hoping you'd come." Music faded as she took her hands off the keys. The silence that followed was warm, not empty. She stood up and turned to him. Her dress reflected the light from the window. Her hair was simply pinned up today, a single curl falling near her ear. He looked at her as one looks at something delicate and holy. "I didn't sleep," he said. "Me neither." He stepped closer. "I wanted to say something yesterday," he added, "but I couldn't find the words." She nodded slowly. "You don't have to, not if it's too early." "I think you already know that." She smiled, but there was something gentle and painful in her eyes. "I do, but I want to hear them." He hesitated, then reached into his coat again. This time, instead of a letter, he pulled out a single object, a pressed violet, small, deep purple and completely whole. "It's the flower from the box your father gave you," he said. "I saw it once, years ago. You had one in your hair when we were children. I've never forgotten it." She stared at it in shock. The memory suddenly returned, a summer in her childhood, a game in the garden, a cousin from abroad watching quietly under a tree. At the time, she had no idea what this moment would become. But he had remembered. Her voice trailed off. "You carry this memory with you all the time?" "I think I've been carrying you this whole time." She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward and took the violet from his hand. Her fingers lingered there, wrapping around his, just long enough for the world around them to disappear. And then, quietly and without ceremony, she spoke the words that had remained hidden behind her breath for so long. "I love you, Albert." It wasn't shouted.
It wasn't even spoken.
It was simply laid out in the air, a truth that lay gently between them, like a petal on an open leaf. He blinked, but his lips curled into that calm, full smile she loved so much. "I love you too." And with that, something changed. Not in the world, outside, which was still spinning as always, but within the walls of this music room, something eternal was sealed, not with signatures or state documents, but with the meeting of two hearts that had grown slowly, patiently, and completely. Later that evening, she sat alone in her bedroom, her heart still pounding from the conversation. She hadn't written anything in her diary. She hadn't told her mother, but she felt more like herself today than she had in all the years before. She held the violet gently in her hand, tucked away in the same journal that once held her fears. Its petals were carefully pressed between pages filled with hope. She added a line below her last entry. "He remembered me before I even knew I was worth remembering." She closed the book, leaned back in her chair, and watched the rain drip down the glass. Below her the garden shimmered, not in the light, but in memory. And even though the words were finally spoken, she knew that this love had lived in silence for much longer than either of them realized. Because sometimes the heart speaks before the lips do, and when it finally echoes loudly, nothing is as it was. Morning arrived slowly, veiled in pale grey, and a stillness that clung to the walls like breath on cold glass. Catherine awoke where she had fallen asleep, curled beside the hearth, her hand still gently resting in Heathcliff's. For a few moments she did not move. There was peace here, the rare kind, fragile and fleeting, found only after storms. She opened her eyes to the soft light, the embers barely warm now, and looked at him. He had not slept. His gaze was on the window, distant but awake, as though he had watched the sky shift through every hour of the night. When he finally looked at her, there was no surprise, no startle, only recognition, as if this moment had lived in his mind long before it came. "I never knew the fire could go out so quietly," she whispered. "It waited for us," he said simply. And then it let go. They sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the silence. That held them. There was no need for questions. Last night had not mended them, nor broken them. It had only revealed them again as they were, and perhaps as they would always be. Heathcliff stood, stretched, and walked toward the writing desk near the back wall. Catherine followed with her eyes. She had not looked there in years. He pulled open the drawer and lifted a folded cloth. Beneath it, more pages, loose sheets, ink-smudged, creased, frayed at the corners. He placed a few of them gently on the table and turned to her. "These
are the ones I never burned," he said. Catherine approached slowly, as though nearing a memory made flesh. Each letter was addressed only with her name. No embellishment, no title. Just Catherine. She picked one up with trembling fingers and unfolded
it. The handwriting was rough but intimate, as if the words had been pulled straight from a storm. "I dreamed of you last night. Not in silk, not behind stone walls, but standing barefoot on the moors. You laughed. I woke up missing the sound. Another letter. Do you know that I speak to the wind when I miss you? It carries nothing back, but I listen anyway. And another. Sometimes.
I think the house remembers your footsteps. I walk after them, pretending I'm just a shadow." Catherine pressed the pages to her chest.
Her eyes closed, and for a long while neither of them moved. "You never sent them," she murmured. "You were never far enough for me to try," he replied. "But I was," she whispered. "Even here. Even when we shared the same sky." Heathcliff leaned against the table, watching her. "There was always something between us," he said. "Not distance. Something deeper. Like the part of the moor you can see, but can't walk on." Her eyes found his. "I don't want to be a place."
"You only see?"
"Then don't go back," he said. The words hung between them, unspoken for years, and now laid bare like the pages in her hands. "I don't know how to stay," she admitted. "I don't know how to be with you, and not lose the other life."
"I built." Heathcliff didn't argue, he didn't plead, he only said, "Then let's write it differently."
She looked down at the letters again, her fingers brushing over the ink, the love, the longing that had lived in these pages while the world outside demanded silence. Then she nodded, and together, without speaking, they began to write. Not to one another, but with each other. Letters with no names, just thoughts, feelings, reminders. A way to speak when presence became too loud, a way to remember when time tried to steal meaning. They wrote until the candle burned low, until the world outside quieted, until the house, too, learned to breathe again. But what if words were all they could hold, and the days ahead asked them to let go again? Morning arrived without colour, just a dim grey light slipping through the warped glass windows, touching the old stones of Wuthering Heights like the ghost of sunlight. Catherine stirred first, still curled beside the hearth, where the ashes from last night's fire lay cold and still. Heathclif was awake already, watching her quietly from the chair nearby, unmoving except for the gentle rise and fall of his chest. She blinked the sleep from her eyes and looked toward him. "Did you sleep?" He shook his head. A soft sigh escaped her lips. "Why do you always wait?" "Because I never know if you'll return," he said. "But I need to be here if you do." She sat up slowly, brushing stray locks of hair from her face, her fingers tracing the threads of the old rug beneath her. The silence wrapped around them again, not empty, but thoughtful. She glanced toward the hearth where only a faint warmth lingered from the night before. "It's strange," she whispered, "how this place hasn't changed, yet everything inside me feels different." Heathclif didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked over to the far wall, kneeling beside a loose stone hidden behind the firewood stack. Catherine tilted her head in quiet curiosity as he pried it loose, revealing a small, hollow space beneath. Within he pulled a wooden box. It was old, the wood softened with age, the lid wrapped with a thin strip of faded cloth that might once have been blue. He sat back down and placed it between them. "What is it?" she asked softly, though part of her already knew. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were things she hadn't expected. Not just letters, but small remnants of years spent loving in silence. A dried sprig of heather, a ribbon she had worn once during their childhood, a scrap of torn fabric from her dress after she'd caught it on a thorn bush, a pebble shaped like a heart, and beneath all of it, carefully folded, more letters, older, fainter. She reached inside and picked up the top one. The paper was yellowing, the ink faded, the handwriting less steady than she remembered. But the moment she unfolded it, the air between them seemed to hush. "Catherine, you were 12 when you told me the wind loved you." I laughed. "I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. I kept your laugh in my pocket that day. I've never let it go." "Yours, always, H." She looked up at him, her throat tight. "You never gave me these." "I didn't think they were worth giving," he said. "They weren't written to be answered." She shook her head slowly. "You never let yourself believe you were enough." "I wasn't." Catherine drew a long breath and reached for his hand. "You were. You always were." He looked at her then, eyes glassy but not broken. "Then why did you leave?" The question wasn't an accusation. It was a wound reopened, but without bitterness. "Because I was afraid," she answered. "Afraid that loving you would cost me everything else. I thought I had to choose between the world and you. I didn't know the world would feel so hollow without you in it." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the box. "I buried these here the day you said you'd marry Edgar," he said. "Not out of spite, but because I needed a place to grieve." Catherine closed her eyes. "I didn't know how to be both Catherine Earnshaw and someone else's wife," she whispered. "I thought I could divide myself and still be whole." Heathclif nodded slowly, his voice low. "We were never meant to be divided. She reached into the box again, lifting one letter at a time. Each was a moment frozen, a whisper on paper, a memory inked and stored. Some were just fragments. You danced in the rain once, alone. I watched you and wanted to be the storm. You said you belonged to the wind, so I stood still for you. You don't know how often you haunt me in rooms you've never entered. Letter after letter, line after
line, and she realized he hadn't just loved her. He had remembered her. Every moment, every breath, even when she had forgotten herself. A tear slipped down her cheek. I never asked what you needed, she said. Heathcliff looked at her.
Then steady and calm. I only ever needed this. You here. Not polished, not dressed, just you. Catherine leaned forward, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time. The box between them, the letters like embers, glowing softly even, in the absence of flame. I want to stay, she murmured. He didn't react. I don't mean today, she continued. I mean, I want to stop running. I want to stop splitting myself in two. He placed his hand over hers. Then stop. But
how?
You already have, he whispered. The moment passed like a feather drifting on a current, so light, yet impossible to forget. Later, she tucked the letters back into the box, carefully, like they were holy things. When she placed the last one inside, she added something else. A note of her own, freshly written. I see you now. I see all of it. And I'm no longer afraid to be whole. They sealed the box together and placed it back behind the stone. Not to hide it, but to preserve
it.
Not to bury the past, but to honor it. And as the day faded into evening, and the wind returned once more to kiss the windows, they sat by the fire again, not with a need to speak, but with the comfort of knowing that they finally could. But would the world outside allow them to stay in this fragile peace, or tear it apart once more? The sky was brittle that morning, not broken, not stormy, but still, and stretched in a pale silence that pressed gently on the land. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, the kind that holds its breath before something unravels. Inside Wuthering Heights, Catherine stood at the small attic window, her arms folded tightly against herself, her cheek resting against the cold glass. Below, the moors shimmered with frost. The heather was bowed low, the trees unmoving. She could not hear the wind. Heathclif was downstairs, splitting firewood with quiet precision. The sound of the axe echoed through the bones of the house, not harsh, but rhythmic, steady. Each strike against the log was like the beat of a heart trying not to feel too much. They had spent 3 days together since she'd returned, 3 days of hushed comfort and shared meals, of long glances and half-spoken truths. At night, they sat near the fire as they always had, not touching, not naming what pulsed between them, but letting the nearness speak its own language. And each time she looked at him, she saw the boy and the man woven into one. But now, the silence between them was beginning to shift. It was no longer the soft silence of understanding. It had begun to change, sharpened at the edges, filled with something unspoken, like a question neither dared ask. That evening, as dusk folded, in early, and the chimney smoke curled into the fading sky, Heathclif returned inside. He brushed frost from his shoulders and poured water into the kettle. Catherine watched from the chair, her fingers curled tightly in her lap. "You're quiet today," he said without turning. "So are you." He nodded once. She stood slowly and crossed the room. Are we pretending this isn't fragile? He turned then, fully meeting her gaze. No, I think we both know it is. She paused. Then why are we walking so carefully around it? Heathcliff looked at her for a long moment. Because if we speak too loudly, it might break. She took another step toward him, her voice trembling. Do you think it's already broken? He shook his head. Not broken. Just waiting. For what? For you to decide if you belong here, he said quietly. Or if this is just another visit before you return to the life you've chosen. Her breath hitched. I never chose it. You
did, he said. Even if you didn't mean to. She swallowed hard. I'm trying to unchoose it now. Then say it, he said, stepping closer. Say that you'll stay. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come, and in that absence, the silence sharpened. I want to, she whispered finally.
But I don't know what happens after. He studied her, the flickering firelight catching in his eyes. Nothing happens after, just this house, these hills, me. Tears welled in her eyes. And Edgar? He asked, the name like a stone dropped in still water. I don't love him, she said. But he loves you. She nodded slowly. He loves who he thinks I am, and I love who I know you are. They stood just inches apart, the air between them vibrating with everything unsaid, and still neither reached out. I'm tired, she whispered, of dividing myself. Then don't, Heathcliff said. You're whole here. Her voice cracked. But it's not just about love. He looked away, jaw clenched. No, he said. It's about choosing what you're willing to give up. They stood in silence. Not the comforting kind this time, but the kind filled with the ache of decision. Later that night, Catherine sat alone in the attic room. The wind had returned at last, brushing gently against the eaves, tapping at the glass like a friend who had come back too late. She stared at the small case she had carried with her, her belongings still folded neatly, untouched since her arrival. And she wondered, was she really here, or had she never truly returned? Downstairs, Heathcliff sat by the cold hearth, staring into the space where the fire should be. In his hands was another letter he would never send. Catherine, if love alone could hold you, you would never have left. But you are not a thing to be held. You are wind and fire, and I am just the stone that waited in silence. But even stones break under time. He didn't burn this one, he placed it with the others, let it rest. And in the deep silence that followed, two hearts, once so close they beat as one, now drifted, not from lack of love, but from the impossibility of holding on to something that had never belonged to the world outside. But what happens when the truth is too heavy to carry and too precious to leave behind? The sun made its first true appearance in days. It filtered softly through the morning mist, brushing the tops of the heather in golden ribbons and casting long, sleepy shadows across the moors. Wuthering Heights stood still under this light, old and unchanged, yet touched briefly by something that almost looked like grace. Catherine stepped out into the open air, wrapped in her shawl, the cold catching her breath and turning it into little clouds. She followed the trail without thinking, her boots pressing into the soft earth, retracing steps she had taken 1,000 times before, and yet each time they felt different, like the land was learning her anew. She had woken that morning with
a heaviness she couldn't name. Not sorrow exactly, but something near it, a quiet ache born from knowing that a decision waited, looming like a hill she didn't want to climb. Behind her, Wuthering Heights remained nestled in its own timelessness.
But ahead was the place where everything might change. She wandered to the east ridge where the heather grew thickest, the spot where she and Heathclif used to lie on their backs and name shapes in the sky. The wind blew lightly now, not wild, not angry, just present. She sat down on the cold stone where he had once left a letter tucked under a rock. She closed her eyes and let the past settle around her like a blanket. Moments later, she heard footsteps, not rushed, not hesitant, just familiar. Heathclif didn't speak when he reached her. He stood beside the stone, hands deep in his coat pockets, staring out toward the horizon as if it held an answer neither of them had yet found. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly. "I always come when the wind carries your name," he replied. They sat in silence for a while, side by side, eyes cast out over the land that had raised them, shaped them, and somehow always brought them back to each other. "I thought I knew how this would end," Catherine said finally. "How?" he asked. "With me choosing you and everything else falling away." "And now," she sighed, "now I realize. I don't know if love is something you choose or something you carry, whether you want to or not." He nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Love isn't a path. It's the space between them." She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with both longing and regret. "We keep meeting in the middle, don't we? In that in-between place." "That's where we've always lived," he said. She reached for his hand. Their fingers touched.
Lightly, not with desperation, but with the fragile peace of people who knew what it meant to hold on too tightly and what it cost to let go. "I'm tired of almost," she whispered.
"So am I," he replied. "But we keep dancing around it," she said. "This life we never started, this love we never named." He looked down at their hands. "Because if we ever stopped dancing, we'd have to face the truth." She
nodded, that it may already be too late. The wind swept gently across the ridge, rustling the heather and pulling at the hem of her dress.
Birds wheeled in the sky above, their cries lost to the wind. "I don't want to marry him," Catherine said suddenly. "But I don't know how not to." Heathclif didn't flinch. "You do." "I'm afraid." "So am I," he admitted. She smiled faintly. "You've never said that before." "I've never had this much to lose before." The sun slipped lower in the sky as the afternoon wore on, their shadows stretching longer behind them. "Do you remember the first time I said your name?" Catherine asked. He turned to her. "Yes. We were under the trees and I had just cut my palm. You took my hand like it was yours. I wanted to keep you," she whispered. "Not own you, just keep you close." "I never left," he said, "but I did." And then, with tears in her eyes, she said what had remained unspoken for years. "I love you." He closed his eyes. "I've always loved you." His voice trembled as he responded. "And I've lived every day with that love, even when you were gone." They leaned in then, foreheads touching gently, breath shared in the stillness. And for that one moment, the world disappeared. The years fell away, the mistakes faded, only love remained, pure and whole and aching. But neither kissed the other, neither made promises. They sat together until the light faded completely letting the wind carry the rest of their truths. When they finally stood, it was with hands clasped and hearts steady, but still unsure of what came next. Because sometimes even the deepest love cannot rewrite the shape the world demands of you. But can it bend it just enough? The house had grown quiet again. Not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the fragile hush of something waiting, like the pause between inhale and exhale, between decision and consequence. Wuthering Heights had always held its secrets close, but now it seemed to lean into them, every creaking stair and whispering window adding weight to what was left unsaid. Catherine moved through its rooms as if half asleep, touching old banisters and cold stone walls as though they might speak to her, remind her who she had once been before everything had become tangled. Her footsteps made no sound on the rugs. Her breath was soft, her presence like a ghost lingering. In her own story, in the drawing room, the air was heavy. She paused in the doorway, her eyes catching the reflection of herself in the dark glass of the window. She looked older. Not in age, but in memory. Behind her, a door creaked open. Heathclif stood at the threshold, one hand still resting on the
knob, his eyes fixed on her with that steady, unreadable gaze. "I thought you left," she said quietly. "I did," he replied.
"But I came back." "For me?" "No, for the truth." She turned to face him fully. "And what is it?" she asked. He stepped closer. "That you're still standing here, that you haven't chosen. But you haven't walked away either." Looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "I don't know how to choose between a life that makes sense and a love that never did." "Then maybe don't," he said. "Maybe let it choose you." Catherine took a trembling breath. "I
hear you in every room, even when you're not in it."
Every time I open a door, I think I'll find you there." Heathcliff smiled faintly. "You always did." She moved toward him slowly, not with urgency, but with certainty. The door behind him remained open, and the cold draught slipped in around them, but neither moved to close it. "Do you ever wish you hadn't loved me?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "But I wish it had been easier." She stepped into his arms then. Not like a reunion, not like a surrender, but like a truth returning home. He held her lightly at first, as if testing the edges of the moment, unsure if it would break. But it didn't. "I'm tired of waiting behind doors," she whispered. "Of hiding in rooms that don't belong to me." "Then stop," he said gently. "Come in, stay." "I want to," she said, "but I'm afraid that once I do, I'll never be able to leave again." "You never really left," he replied. "You just forgot how to return." They stood like that for a long while, shadows soft around them, the fire in the hearth crackling.
Low and steady. And somewhere in the quiet of the house, a floorboard creaked. Not from footsteps, but memory. Catherine leaned her head against his chest. "There's a letter in my drawer at the Grange," she whispered. "Written for you. I never sent it." "What did it say?" "That if I ever came back, it wouldn't be to visit. It would be to stay."
He drew in a breath, slow and deep, as though he could feel the words moving through him. "But you didn't send it," he said. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe it." He touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. "Say it now." "I want to stay." He looked into her eyes. "Then do." But the door behind him remained open, and Catherine glanced toward it once more, not as an exit, but as a memory of all the times she had turned away from what she truly wanted. "I'm tired," she said, "of pretending that I'm not yours." "You were always mine," he replied, "even when you weren't." The wind outside pushed a little harder, as though urging the house to remember to breathe again. Catherine kissed his cheek, light, soft, the way wind might kiss stone after centuries, and then she stepped back. "I need to return," she said, "to end it properly." He nodded, not with anger, but with understanding. "I'll wait," he said. "You always do." And then, without another word, she turned and walked through the open door into the cold wind, down the familiar path that led once more away from home. But something in the way she walked was different now. She did not flinch from the wind. She did not rush. And behind her, Heathcliff closed the door, not to shut her out, but to keep the warmth inside for when she returned. Because this time, the wind whispered something new. She would come back, and when she did, the door would already be open. The moors stretched endlessly beneath her boots, the wild heather brushing against her skirt, the sky soft with clouds that barely moved. Catherine had walked this path many times in her life, as a child, as a dreamer, as a woman torn between two worlds. But today it felt different. The wind had changed. It didn't call her forward, it carried her. She paused on the ridge, looking back at Wuthering Heights, just a silhouette now, half swallowed by the rising mist. She could no longer see its windows or hear the creak of its old bones in the wind, but she could feel it deep in her chest, like a heartbeat answering her own. And yet she kept walking. The Grange came into view slowly, its edges too smooth, its gardens too still. Even from a distance, Catherine felt the difference. This place was manicured, designed for calm, built for control. But she no longer belonged to calmness. She belonged to the wild. When she arrived at the gate, Isabella was waiting. "You've come back," she said, surprised but not unkind. Catherine offered a faint smile. "For a little while." "You look different," Isabella said, stepping aside to let her in. "I am." Inside, everything was as it had been. The tea set in its usual place, the curtains drawn just so, the air perfumed faintly with rosewater. But it all felt like memory now, or a dream she had woken from. She went to her room first. It was untouched. The case she'd left half-packed still lay at the foot of the bed. The letter she had mentioned to Heathcliff, the one tucked away in her drawer, was still there too, sealed and unfinished. She sat down beside it, her fingers resting on the envelope. It was time. She opened it and began to write, not just for him but for herself. "Heathcliff, I know now that the world I tried to live in without you was never mine. It was borrowed, and I've grown tired of returning things that were never meant to fit.
I left not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't yet know how to carry love, that wild, that deep, that whole. But I've walked through every room, through every silence, and your name echoed in them all. I'm not coming back because I miss you. I'm coming back because I remember who I am when I'm near you, and that's who I choose to be. Yours truly, C."
She folded it carefully and placed it in her case. Later that afternoon, Edgar found her in the library. "I didn't expect you back so soon," he said. "I needed to come," she replied. He studied her face. "There's something you're not saying." She met his gaze gently. "There's something I need to say, and I hope you'll hear it with the kindness I know lives in you." His expression shifted just slightly. "I can't stay," she said. "Not here. Not like this." Edgar said nothing at first, just nodded slowly. "Because of him?" "Because of me," she said. "Because I've been living a life with only half of myself, and the other half has always been out there, in the wild." He sat in the chair beside her. "You were—"
Never meant to be caged, Catherine. I see that now. She touched his hand, grateful. You've been more kind than I deserved.
He shook his head. "No. Just not what you needed." There were no raised voices, no arguments, just two people letting go of something that had never truly belonged to them. That night, Catherine didn't sleep. She walked the halls of the Grange, one last time, pausing at doorways, running her fingers along the walls, saying goodbye not with sorrow, but with peace. And in the early hours of morning, before the sun could chase away the mist, she stepped outside, back onto the path, back to where the wild things waited. The walk was long, but her feet did not tire. She moved like someone returning home after a long exile, every step loosening the weight in her chest. And when Wuthering Heights appeared on the horizon, just as the sky turned gold, she felt her breath catch. He was waiting for her. Standing near the edge of the path, coat flapping gently in the wind, as if he had never once turned away. Their eyes met across the field. No words, no rush, just recognition. She reached him slowly, her boots caked in mud, her cheeks flushed from the cold. But she had never felt more alive. He took her hand in silence, led her through the door, and when she stepped into the house again, it was not as a visitor. It was as someone who had finally remembered where she belonged, in the wild, in the wind, in the heart that had waited and never stopped loving her. The air inside Wuthering Heights felt warmer now, not from the hearth, though a fire crackled softly in its old stone frame, but from something gentler, something human. Catherine moved through the rooms with a different rhythm than before, as though the walls themselves had recognized her return and exhaled their long-held breath. She no longer paused at doorways. She stepped through them freely, no longer reached for memories. She lived inside them now. It had been 3 days since her return. 3 mornings where she woke to the sound of the wind singing against the windows, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged to its language. 3 evenings of sitting quietly beside Heathclif while the silence between them deepened not into distance, but into comfort. They did not need to talk much. There was no catching up, no recounting of lost time. They carried the past in the way old trees carry rings, not seen, but known. One afternoon, Catherine stood in the garden behind the house, plucking petals from the few stubborn blooms that remained despite the cold. Lavender, soft rose, a single pale daisy. She gathered them gently and placed them between the pages of an old book she had once scribbled in as a girl. Heathclif watched from the kitchen door. "What are you pressing them for?" he asked. She looked up with a faint smile. "To keep something beautiful between the pages. A promise, maybe." He stepped outside, arms crossed loosely. "Of what?" "That I won't forget again," she said, meeting his eyes. Later they sat together at the small writing desk in the corner of the room. The box of letters remained closed, not because it was no longer needed, but because it had already spoken everything that needed to be heard. Catherine took out a clean sheet of
paper. I want to start again, she said. Heathcliff tilted his head.
writing, living. She dipped the quill, and in delicate strokes she wrote a letter she would never send. To the girl I once was, you were wild and soft, stormy and sure. You loved with your whole chest, and you never learned to be quiet. They taught you to bow your head, to whisper, to wear silk when your soul wanted heather. But you are home now, you are no longer split. You have returned to the one who spoke your name like a prayer, not to own you, but to understand you. Let the world be what it is. You are wind, and you are finally free. She folded it and slipped it into the old book, between the petals, where time would press it gently. That evening the sky turned violet over the moors. Heathcliff lit the lanterns early, their glow casting golden halos in every room. Catherine moved beside him in silence, helping with the little things, placing cups by the hearth, folding the blankets, feeding the small fire. It felt like they had always done this, like the world before had only been a shadow. As the night settled, she looked over at him and said softly, "Tell me something you never told me." He paused, then replied, "When you left, I used to sit under the tree near the stream and read your name aloud." She smiled, her voice barely a breath. "Why?" "Because the wind always answered back." She reached out and took his hand. "You never stopped loving me," she said. He shook his head. There was never a moment to stop. They sat close that night, their shoulders brushing, their hands still clasped as the fire warmed the floor beneath them. They didn't speak of tomorrow or of what others might say. The world had faded outside these walls. What remained was this: a promise not spoken but kept, a love not declared but lived, and a house that had waited through storms and seasons for this quiet return. And as Catherine rested her head against his shoulder, eyes drifting closed, she whispered one final truth. "I am whole now." It was one of those rare mornings when the sun rose without warning, sudden and gold, spilling warmth across the moors like a secret finally spoken. The light crept through the windows of Wuthering Heights, brushing over old wooden floors and flickering across the kitchen table where two cups sat close together, untouched but warm. Catherine stood barefoot near the back door, the cool stone under her feet grounding her in a way that silk slippers never had. Her shawl hung loosely around her shoulders, and in her hand was a single petal, pressed from the bouquet she had dried in her book the night before. She held it up to the light and watched it glow, paper-thin, delicate, and yet somehow eternal. Behind her, Heathcliff watched in silence. He had always admired her in quiet ways, the way her fingers moved like she was always touching something sacred, the way her breath slowed when the wind rose, the way she could hold stillness without fearing it. He stepped closer, but didn't speak. She felt him anyway. "You remember the night I fell asleep beside the fire?" she asked. He nodded. "You said your dreams were full of storms." They were, but you were always there. Holding the door open, he smiled faintly. "I
never knew if you wanted to come in." "I always did," she said, turning toward him. The light cast a soft halo around her, and for a moment she didn't look like the girl who had run across the moors or the woman who had once left in silence. She looked like both. Complete. Real. He reached out and with the back of his hand he brushed a lock of hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it. His touch was light, as if he feared she might vanish again.
But her hand found his wrist, holding it there. "I'm not leaving," she whispered. "Not again." They stood like that. Not kissing, not confessing, just touching, just being. And it was enough. The hours passed gently. They spent the day tending to small things, fetching water from the well, sweeping ash from the hearth, folding linens that had not been used in years, but each task felt sacred now, not because of what they were doing, but because they were doing it together. That afternoon, Catherine found an old tin of dried herbs in the back of the pantry. She boiled water, crushed mint with her fingers, and made tea the way Nellie used to when they were children. Heathclif watched her move through the kitchen like she had never left. "You belong here," he said. She turned, smiling softly. "I always did." As they sat by the fire that evening, Catherine curled beside him on the worn rug, her head resting lightly against his chest. The fire cast shadows that danced along the walls, and the wind outside hummed like a lullaby, meant only for them. He traced the edge of her fingers with his own. "I used to imagine this," he said. "You beside me, no words, just the sound of you breathing." She nestled closer. "And I used to imagine waking up and not feeling like something was missing." "Do you still?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, you were the missing." The fire crackled, and as the night deepened, she leaned up slightly, brushing her lips gently against the curve of his jaw. It was not a kiss filled with urgency or hunger. It was the kind that says, "I see you."
"I am here." He turned toward her, and their foreheads met. The smallest space between them charged with years of longing, of near misses, of silent love. She whispered, "You still make the world quiet." "And you still make it feel alive," he replied.
They kissed then, not to claim, but to remember. Not to possess, but to return. When they finally pulled apart, they didn't speak. There was nothing left to explain, only the touch that lingered, only the truth that had always been there, in every look, every silence, every letter that had never needed to be sent. And as the stars blinked to life beyond the windows, Catherine laid her head back on his chest and closed her eyes, the rhythm of his heart carrying her into dreams. This
time. There were no storms, only stillness, only warmth, and the whisper of his hand holding hers through the dark.
The rain began before dawn. It started as a whisper, a soft pattering against the old slate roof, as if the sky itself had tiptoed back to Wuthering Heights, reluctant to disturb the peace inside. By morning, it had grown stronger, soaking, the moors draping the hills in mist and tracing silver rivers down the window panes. Catherine lay in bed, awake but still, listening to the rain. She did not shiver beneath the blankets. She did not stir with restlessness. She simply listened, her eyes open to the soft light and her fingers curled gently around the edge of the coverlet. Heathclif was still asleep beside her, one arm draped across the pillow she had only just left. For a moment, she watched him. He was not handsome in the way the world celebrated. He was carved by time, weathered by silence, hardened by absence. But there was something beautiful in that. In the way his breath came evenly, in the way his hand twitched lightly in sleep, as if reaching for her, even in dreams. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in her shawl, and stepped out into the hallway. The house groaned softly under the rain, its bones old but strong. Each creak beneath her footstep was a memory. She passed the writing desk where the letters had once sat, past the hearth still bearing the scent of last night's fire, past the window where she had once watched for him and never known Dede was already near. Outside, the stone path glistened with water, slick and shining. She opened the door and stepped onto it. The rain met her gently, not cold, but honest. It soaked into her shawl, kissed her hair, ran down her cheeks like tears. That didn't hurt. The moors stretched before her, half shrouded in fog, and though she could barely see their farthest edges, she could feel them. Every blade of grass, every rock they had once sat on, every path that had led her here. She walked slowly, not to escape, not to reflect, but simply because the land was calling, and she knew its voice too well to ignore it. By the time she reached the old ash tree by the stream, her clothes were soaked through, but she didn't care. She sat down on the same flat stone they had always shared, the one that leaned slightly to the left, just enough to catch the rain and collect it in a shallow puddle. She closed her eyes. The sound of the rain on stone was steady, ancient, like a heartbeat from the earth itself. And then, footsteps. She opened her eyes as Heathcliff appeared through the fog, his coat pulled tight, his hair already drenched. He didn't say anything as he sat beside her, their shoulders brushing, their silence immediate and full. "You always find me," she said. "I never lose you," he replied. They watched the stream rush by, fuller now from the rain, its current quick and silver. "Do you remember?" she said softly. "When we used to build little boats from bark and send them down this stream?" He smiled. "And argue about which would make it furthest. You always won," she said. "No," he replied. "Yours were always better. I just wanted to follow them." They sat in the rain until their fingers wrinkled, until the cold had crept through every seam of their clothes. But they didn't move. The rain, for once, was not a threat. It was a rhythm, a reminder. Catherine turned to him. "Everything's changed," she said. "And nothing has," he answered. She nodded. "We are older, weathered, not the children who ran wild through the heather." "No," he said, "but we are still wild, just quieter." She reached for his hand and he met her halfway. "This time," she whispered, "I won't run.
No," he said, "because this time I'm not letting you go." A bird called in the distance, a single, sharp cry through the fog, carried by the wind and softened by the rain.
It sounded like hope. They stood together then and began the slow walk back, not rushing, not speaking, just walking, letting the rain baptize the path beneath them. When they reached the house, she paused on the steps and turned back to look at the moors. "Do you think the land remembers us?" she asked. Heathcliff followed her gaze. It never forgot. And as they stepped back inside, dripping and chilled, the warmth of the hearth already rising to meet them, Catherine knew. This wasn't a return. This was a beginning. The fire was already burning when they returned. Not a large fire, just a steady glow in the hearth, its flames licking gently at the old birch logs, casting soft orange light onto the stone floor and painting the room in slow-moving shadows. Catherine stepped inside first, shedding her wet shawl and draping it over the back of the chair nearest the fire. Heathcliff followed quietly, shaking droplets from his coat before hanging it on the crooked hook near the door. Neither of them spoke as they moved. The silence was still too full from the walk, from the rain, from everything they had left unspoken by the stream. They settled into their familiar places by the fire. She curled on the rug, legs folded beneath her damp hair falling around her face in soft waves. He sat back in the chair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other draped loosely across his lap. The fire crackled. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. Like them. Catherine watched the flames for a long time, her eyes reflecting the flickers of light and shadow. "There's something I've never told you," she said finally. Heathcliff looked at her, patient. "The first time I left Wuthering Heights," she continued, "I told myself I was doing it for everyone else, for my father's name, for Edgar's kindness, for a future that looked better on paper." She paused, her voice softer now. "But the truth is, I left because I didn't believe I deserved to be loved by you." His brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because you saw me, all of me," she said. "And no one else ever did. And I was afraid that being seen meant I'd have to stay that way forever." He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. Catherine turned toward the fire again. "I used to sit in front of this very hearth and try to imagine what my life would look like without you. And every version I pictured was quieter, neater, but always emptier." He spoke now, his voice low. "And I used to watch the fire and wonder if it could burn through memory." She looked up. "I tried to forget," he said. "Not because I wanted to, but because it was the only way to keep breathing when you weren't here." A single log split in the fire, the sound crisp but gentle, like a sentence too long delayed. "I thought I'd ruined everything," she whispered. "You didn't," he replied. "You just left space for something to grow." They sat in silence again, not the painful kind, but the quiet reflection of two souls learning how to rest inside one another. The fire spoke in soft pops and sighs, as though it too had things it had long wished to say. "I used to write letters to the fire," Catherine said suddenly. "Not on paper, just in my head. I would say your name with every spark." "I heard them," Heathcliff said, "even when you were gone." He moved from the chair and sat beside her on the rug. Their knees touched. The warmth of the fire seeped into their skin. "I don't need grand moments anymore," she said. "I just need this. You, the fire, the moors." He reached for her hand. "This is all I ever wanted," he said. She rested her head on his shoulder. "We lost so
much time." "Yes," he agreed, "but we kept each other."
The flames danced, time softened, and outside the rain slowed to a hush. The wind pressed gently against the windows, not demanding entry, but simply reminding them that it, too, remembered. As night fell deeper and the fire burned low, Catherine dozed against him, her breath slow, her hand still in his. And Heathcliff, who had waited through years of silence and loss, finally allowed himself to rest. Not because everything was perfect, but because, for the first time in a long time, nothing
needed to be, because the fire had spoken, and they had heard it.
The morning came gently. The sky was a quiet shade of blue, veiled with thin clouds that drifted like forgotten thoughts. The moors glistened with dew, each blade of grass shimmering in the light like it had been kissed by sleep. Wuthering Heights was silent, not from sorrow but from stillness, the kind that comes after the storm has passed, after the waiting has ended. Catherine woke slowly. The air smelled of ash and lavender. The fire had burned itself low, but its warmth still lingered on the stone. She stretched beneath the old blanket, her hand reaching across the rug, expecting to find his. But Heathcliff wasn't there. She rose, her bare feet padding across the room as she followed the quiet sound of pages turning. He was at the writing desk. The window beside him was open, letting in the breeze that carried the scent of the hills and the hush of the wind through grass. His head was bowed, his hand moving slowly across the page. She stepped closer. "What are you writing?" she asked softly. He didn't look up right away. He finished the line he was on, the pen lingering a moment too long, as though reluctant to lift. "A letter," he said at last. "For me?" He nodded. She smiled. "You could have just told me." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Some things
are better written." She came to stand behind him, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. He passed the letter to her without a word. She took it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the page.
The ink was still wet in places, the strokes careful, almost reverent. "Catherine, I have written so many letters I never gave you. I kept them like prayers. Quiet, folded, and burning inside me. But this is the last one. Not because I have nothing left to say, but because everything I ever wanted is here, now, with me, alive. You don't need my words anymore. You have me, and I have you. No promises, no questions, just us. As we always were beneath the sky, beside the fire, and in the space where silence becomes home. This isn't goodbye. It's the end of waiting. Yours, forever, Heathcliff." Catherine closed her eyes. Tears did not fall, but her heart swelled, too full for sound. She folded the letter carefully, kissed its edge and held it to her chest. "I want to keep it," she whispered. "It's already yours," he replied. They spent the rest of the morning in quiet comfort. They didn't leave the house. They didn't need to. The world came to them. Through the open windows, the scent of the heather, the light footsteps of sparrows on the roof. Later they sat by the hearth again. Catherine brought down a small tin from the shelf, the one where she had pressed petals and hidden notes. She placed the final letter inside. "Will you ever write again?" Heathcliff asked. She turned toward him. "Maybe, but not because I need to. Only because I want to," he nodded. That night the fire burned steady. They lay on the rug, not for warmth, but because it had always been theirs. The ceiling above them faded into shadow. The wind outside sang a song only they could understand. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked, her voice soft with sleep. Heathcliff kissed her hair. "Even when we're gone, the wind will still whisper our names," she smiled. "Then we'll never be forgotten." "No," he said. "Not here. Not in this house. Not in these hills." And as sleep gently carried her into dreams, she felt his hand in hers. Steady, warm, true. The last letter had been written, but the story had never needed words. Because it had always lived in the space between them, the moors were in bloom again, not with vibrant colour. They rarely offered that. But with the soft blush of heather returning after the frost, like memory blooming in silence. The wind that danced across the hills no longer carried urgency. It carried peace. Catherine stood at the edge of the field, behind Wuthering Heights, her eyes closed, her arms loosely folded around herself. The breeze tugged gently at her dress, wove through her hair, brushed her skin with a touch she had come to recognize as belonging to home. Heathcliff stood a few steps behind her, quiet as ever, his presence as steady as stone. I used to wonder,
"If the moors were lonely," she said, "before I understood that they're only waiting." "For what?" he asked. "For someone to come back." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable, not from hiding, but from depth.
from everything that had been lived, loved, lost, and found again between them. "I'm not afraid any more," she said. He nodded, as if that was all he'd ever wanted to hear. They walked the path together, side by side, not saying much. There was no need. Every footstep was a conversation, every glance a reply. The silence between them was no longer about distance, it was their language. They visited the ash tree by the stream. They walked to the eastern ridge where the wind met the sky. They passed the old stone they'd sat on as children, as strangers, as something unnameable, and now as home. That evening, Catherine sat by the hearth with her journal in her lap. She wrote not to remember but to mark the present, to gather the peace she finally felt and press it between pages the way she had once pressed flowers. We are not waiting any more. The fire is warm, the house is full, the wind no longer carries sorrow. And the moors are no longer echoes of what we were. They are songs of what we became. She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside the old wooden box of letters. Then she reached for Heathcliff's hand and pulled him gently toward the door. "Come," she said. "One last walk before nightfall." They stepped outside into the dusk, where the world glowed with the kind of light that only comes when day and night hold each other in stillness. The grass was damp with fading dew, the sky a deep shade of lavender, and the air filled with the hush of belonging. As they reached the top of the hill, Catherine stopped. She turned to him and took his face in both hands. "Everything we were—" "It brought us here," she said. He closed his eyes against her touch. "And everything we are," she continued, "will remain here, long after we're gone." He pressed his forehead to hers, and for a moment there was nothing but breath, wind, and the sound of their hearts finally at rest. When they opened their eyes, the stars had begun to show, and the path home shimmered in the dark. They walked back slowly, hand in hand, into the warmth of the house that had waited, into the silence that no longer needed words, into the love that had asked nothing but to be remembered. And as the fire crackled its last, and the wind curled once more around the walls of Wuthering Heights, it carried with it the names of two souls who had never been lost, only waiting to come home, not in grand endings, but in quiet presence, in lingering touch, in the moors that remembered everything. Thank you, my sleep fellows, for dreaming with us. May the wind whisper softly to you tonight, and may love, like the moors, always guide you home.